We're going to have a very, very casual conversation on stage. Please write down your questions because we will open it up to the floor with the last 10, 15 minutes or so. So don't worry, we'll get you guys in. We do have coffee after that too, so if I don't go to you, you can go and harass them afterwards before they leave, because I know not everybody's going to be staying. So we went through one introduction of Mr. Signé, so I'm just going to add to that. I asked all of them, a little tidbit about themselves in regards to what people don't know. Yeah, you do sports and all that, but on his downtime, he writes poetry. So there's one little thing. And I know, everybody's like, the ladies are loving that. We have let's actually start down there. Mr. Kola Adesina, he's the Group Managing Director of Sahara Power Group. You have an expertise in energy and infrastructure, which I think is going to be extremely relevant to this conversation. You also work with young entrepreneurs, which I think is going to be relevant for a lot of the people in the audience here. Your little special tidbit is that you pretty much probably could outdo a lot of these guys in chess. You are a chess master. He's very confident about that as well. To my right, you've got Ronak, who your expertise is in risk because you're the director of signal risk, you're the fellow, and a lot of these bios are written out there, so you guys can look this up, the Center for African Management and Markets at the Gordon Institute, where you teach as well, which is a big deal too. You are a big fan of Manchester United, and he did see the game. So I knew that kind of reaction. He was in a pub watching it, a lot of replays of that excellent game. So you can ask him about that or his relevance when it comes to risk and integration in the African culture, either or. And then last but not least, you have Mohamed Dahshan, who is the managing partner at OXCON Consulting. It's an economic development consulting firm. And then he's also a fellow at a DC think tank. You are based where again?
London. Currently.
London. So he's based in London. And, we talk about academic stuff. Everybody on the stage is obviously really intelligent, lots of experience. They do really exciting things. Mohamed, he collects antique documents. So it's exciting. The government documents, too. I really hyped that one up for you.
Nerd level.
Yeah, we're just taking it up a notch.
Yeah.
All right, so let's actually get into, I'm going to start with you since I just picked on you right away. So we talked about just the benefits. We don't need to go over how the free trade agreement is going to help. We know how it's going to help, and every country can benefit. But we often hear about trade, protectionism, to tariff or not to tariff, and these are dominating headlines across the globe. Why do you think it's so important for this to be ratified right now in terms of timing? And this is the free trade agreement we've been talking about.
Well, first, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's good to be home. Class of 16, so.
Former MBA.
Okay, on protectionism, maybe like 2 or 3 points on that. The first thing is that if the world if we fear we're heading into increased protectionism, then it makes even more sense to develop intra-African trade for a number of reasons. One, for instance, we know that intra-African trade usually is higher added value than our exports to the rest of the world. They're primarily manufacturing, as opposed to being primarily natural resources. But also, we are, not a surprise here, Africa is fairly poorly integrated from a trade perspective. Our intra-African trade is roughly 15% of our imports and exports, as opposed to 68% in the EU, 78% in the EU, or 68% in ASEAN. And as such, so it makes sense, it's an important opportunity. At the same time, if we're concerned about protectionism, then that's actually a good chance for us to start upgrading our own regional capabilities, right? I'm a strong believer in regional value chains, which is basically better integration within regions that will probably be more export-oriented, right? So kind of like Southeast Asia did for electronics, countries getting together, banding their production capabilities to better face the international market. So that's an opportunity that we have here. And one last thing I think is worth adding is that we're not completely immune of protectionism either, right? It's not just US and China. We also had when we're discussing that agreement, you had that coming up a lot in the discussion within Africa, right? So Nigeria, for instance, was one of the countries whose both the manufacturer association but also the labor unions were very strongly putting strong concerns about how that might hurt local industries and so on. Now, it's interesting that this comes from the biggest economy in the continent, because that's exactly the same, they're having the exact same kind of concerns as the smaller countries. So that means that there's an opportunity here. It also proves that we need to do a lot more when it comes to sort of fine-tuning that agreement. So Landry's speech, for instance, was mentioning special treatment for least developed countries, for instance. So these are one of the things that we can put in place to sort of better take advantage of that, while at the same time alleviating those protectionist pressures that we have within Africa.
And you actually just brought up Nigeria, just for the audience. There was a quote from the Nigerian Labor Congress, and they said it's the actual free trade agreement is extremely dangerous and radioactive neoliberal policy. But I'm going to move on, Landry, for you, just to discuss the fact that there are already existing trade agreements, not only with the countries within the continent and outside of the continent, but you have all of these acronyms that we don't even need to go, all these trade agreements that have already been established. So how do you assure, or what should be done to make sure there's no overlap and show that this African Continental Free Trade Agreement, another acronym, is better and will offer more to those involved?
Yes, that has been a concern for many people, but the first thing to say is that even in the conceptualization of the CFTA, the RECs, the regional economic communities, are integrated in the decision-making process, which means that they are in charge for the next few years of ensuring the successful implementation of the CFTA at the sub-regional level, and hopefully later being integrated continentally. So, but one thing to say is that we also have monetary unions, and I think those, unless the African Monetary Union is implemented, which will not happen tomorrow, so those sub-regional monetary unions, I think about Central Africa, West Africa, will remain effective. So
until that point, do you think there'll be a consolidation?
The goal is to consolidate. I think President Ramaphosa of South Africa has been also one of the advocates for a continental currency. However, I think many countries are very concerned. If we only think about the CFA has generated a lot of debate. The West and the Central and West African currencies from former French colonies. So I think that harmonization of policies will be critical, and for that to happen, countries should first increase the trade amongst nations. And when we speak about the performance of regional economic communities on the continent, there's an asymmetry. For example, Central Africa is underperforming with less than 5% in total of export or trade between the country of the sub-region. So, on one hand, the regional economic communities will be partner for the successful implementation, but on the other hand, for the monetary unions to be uniformized, countries also have to develop a convergent macroeconomic policies. And having said that, of course, some people are wondering, why do we have the CFTA when some of the regional economic communities are not already working? And how can we ensure the successful implementation of the CFTA compared to the past initiative? So I have perhaps 3 or 4 critical points. So the first one is the effective coordination and implementation mechanism. So everything is about implementation to reduce the gap between the intentions, the very great intentions, and the policy outcome. So quite often policy leaders think about the best policies, but they don't take enough into consideration the conditions for a successful implementation of those policies. So this is one of the first points. The second point is compliance and dispute resolution mechanism. Quite often, even when policies are adopted, leaders are not penalized when they are not implementing such policies. We have seen some progress with the African Union reforms, I participated in some debate and engaged with some leaders, and I can tell you that I was shocked by the fact that some were thinking they should not be penalized, even if they don't respect rules. So compliance is critical. A third point is financing. Most of the time, African leaders come with an initiative and hope that the rest of the world should be funding it. And after that, some are wondering, why the people funding are also trying to shape the outcome or the directions. It's normal. When you put your money in something, you want also it to serve your interest. So it will be critical then for African leaders to mobilize domestic resources in order to achieve those goals. And finally, the involvement of the business community. In fact, trade, we cannot have trade without traders, without investors, business leaders. So it's critical for business leaders to engage vigorously in activities across the continent. And I think you have seen Dangote being a strong advocate for the removal of trade barriers and the creation of a conducive business environment.
Thank you. You've outlined you seem very optimistic about it, even within your speech. And actually, that's a great pivot to Ronak, who we were talking about this last night. It's aspirational. You have 19 ratified thus far. Why are you a skeptic of this free trade agreement? I'm sure that this question is passed on some people in the audience's minds. So why do you think?
So I'd say I'm a realist.
Realist, sorry. Okay, realist then.
Because the rhetoric doesn't necessarily match the reality. So you look at the signatories, we've got 50-odd signatories, we've got 19 ratifications. But it's like a Facebook like or an Instagram double tap. Doesn't mean anything, right? So, for me, the talk doesn't necessarily match the action. Because on the one hand, from an ideological perspective, we're talking about reducing the cost of doing business, making it easier, regional cooperation, reduced borders, all that kind of stuff. But then you've got countries like Nigeria, which is taking a very nationalistic and protectionist approach. They've just had an election. Maybe Jubril will do a little bit better. I'm referring to Buhari's supposed clone. But there's a very nationalistic policy kind of orientation there. Same thing with Tanzania. Yeah. So on a kind of more micro level, they're not adding up. And I think ultimately this highlights a few of the tensions that need to be overcome. So on the one hand is this kind of debate between the supranational body versus individual sovereignty of a country. On the other hand, there's this question around accountability. Like Landry mentioned, if people are not performing or complying, is there going to be a stick with which to beat them? Because if you look at the DRC election, for example, and the shenanigans around that from a kind of calling it to account perspective, African countries tend to adopt a policy of non-interference. So ultimately, for me, this is a discussion around political will and willingness to actually implement, because the devil is in the detail. I really hope that it does happen, because I one day want to live on a continent where we use a currency called the Afro. And if OXCON launches his Bitcoin fund, then it can be Afro and A-coin, which would be great, but I'm a little bit cynical.
Okay, and well, you just talked about implementation and how important it is. Kola, can you just talk about given your experience, you've worked in dozens of countries within Africa and in the Middle East, trying to get these countries to work together. So if we take those comments and use your expertise and your past experience, how can we make that happen right now so that we can ensure that the realists in the room will believe that this can, and that there's going to be no sticks to beat them, because they can actually go through with this and follow through all of the countries and not just dominated, like Landry mentioned before, by Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt?
Okay, thanks for the privilege of this invitation. Before addressing that question, I'll first speak to Ronak. The president of Nigeria is Muhammad Buhari and not a Jubril. He's been elected. That's my president. We don't have a clone as a president in Nigeria. That's the very first thing. Now, incidentally, you and I are fans of the same club, Manchester United. So, disagreement and alignment. Now, working in different parts of the world has been quite exciting to me and my company. And the key word is alignment. I've always used the human body as my example of what is required for success in any society. My lungs, my kidney, my liver, my brain. If there is any misalignment, I'm sick, I'm healed, I'm not well. When there is alignment in my body, I'm effective, I'm efficient, I perform, and I deliver results. Wherever we go in Africa and elsewhere, the first thing we seek is alignment. The Labor Union and Manufacturers Association in Nigeria is opposed to this wonderful agreement primarily because of lack of understanding of alignment. Because if somebody somewhere lets them know the value embedded in an agreement of this nature, everybody loves good things. Everybody wants things better, quicker, cheaper, more efficient, and that's what life is all about. So as an organization, wherever we want to operate, we first seek alignment with the people. We respect them. If you don't respect a people, a society, they won't welcome you in. So for them to take us in is respect. It's for them to see the value we're bringing to the table. It's value addition. We're not coming to take something away from you. We're actually coming to align with you to make it better. We don't go with superiority complex, that we're better off and we have resources and knowledge better than theirs. We go there letting them know that, yes, we're here to make things better. And that's the essence of humanity, to make things better.
Yeah.
So as an organization, that's the first thing that we do. Now, in terms of Africa, Africa is still considered a dark continent, primarily because of the fact that 70% of Africa is not lit. So how do we power Africa? So again, back to my company, Sahara, what we do is to evaluate the needs of the various society we want to operate in. What is the missing link to greatness in this society? If you can offer solution to any society, you'll be welcomed, you'll be prosperous, you'll become a Sahara. That's what we've done as an organization.
I hope they're watching the live stream right now, right? Just, yeah, he's doing a good job promoting. You brought up Nigeria, actually. How many people in the audience are from Nigeria? Okay, keep your hands high. How many of you believe that your country will ratify this agreement? Ooh. Okay. So to that point, you have Nigeria that possibly is focusing on protectionism. We talk about tariffs. Mohamed, I'm going to direct this question at you. What about the non-tariff barriers for this agreement, aside from the fact that Nigeria doesn't want to join, and it seems like some of our audience isn't that optimistic either?
So actually, just last week I was supposed to be in Tunis, and I didn't get my visa. And the best part is that I was going for a meeting on freedom of movement. Really, on freedom of movement and regional integration in North Africa. That was the gathering, and I didn't get my visa. So basically, okay, so non-tariff barriers, I guess, especially in our case, so I mean, there's a laundry list of non-tariff barriers, and a big part of our international trade infrastructure is basically about how we transform those non-tariff barriers into tariffs, and then so we can remove the tariffs, right? So that's how the mindset of the WTO, the idea was we simplify these things that are hard to quantify, put them into percentages of tariffs, and then that's what we work on. But you can say that what we have currently, I guess, splits into three things. One, you got institutional barriers, shall we say physical barriers, which are the most obvious, and then historical barriers. Right? Historical barriers, a big part of it is very simply the way our industries have been sort of devised ever since the colonial era, that you're most likely to have, rail tracks going from the mine to the port than you are to the next country, right? So that's a barrier. That's something that we need to work on. The physical one is perhaps the most obvious, physical infrastructure, energy, ports, access, roads, etc. I think the most fascinating project to me on that was the African network of highways. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It's a project that has existed since the early 70s. It's supposed to crisscross the continent with massive highways. A lot of them are coastal. I use that always as an example of how, sort of a microcosm in a way of how that agreement functions or will function what it needs. Because one, you have, on a very long highway, you will have a 200-kilometer segment in the middle that's missing, going through another country. And that means that basically the entire highway is now a couple of small roads, right? Because literally, most vehicles are unable to drive on that. You have maintenance that we realize is now very costly and that in a lot of parts of that highway network is failing. And so on. So infrastructure is definitely a massive thing. And the last thing I was going to add was the institutional barriers. So some of them are formal. Some, like visa requirements, are formal institutional barriers that we need to work on. But what's significantly more complicated is the informal institutional barriers, right? How basically the rules at the border, if you're a small trader especially, it's always harder for a small trader, by the way, who's carrying 20 kilograms of maize than it is for a 40-foot container. But how when they get to the border, the rules are systematically more or less different, depending on the whim of the person who's manning the border post on that day. So these are all barriers that we'll have to address, right? And the most obvious and the most costly one are the infrastructure one. I am literally more concerned about the non-spoken institutional ones, like the informal institutional barriers.
And that's actually a great transition to Landry, just to discuss some of those barriers. We've mentioned infrastructure, power outages continuously happen across the continent, and you have foreign firms that want to come in, want to invest, and you want them to. Can you describe right now how possibly foreigners might see the situation in Africa in general when you bring up the lack of infrastructure, when you bring up energy being a major issue as well? Describe how that could be a deterrent.
So I have engaged extensively with foreign investors, and in Washington, D.C. a few months ago, one came and told me, Landry, I don't understand. We have $20 billion that will be investing in this given country for the next 2 decades or so, and we are not understanding why the government is not quoting us. $20 billion, they were expecting the government to do everything possible to get those resources. And I was engaging with another leaders, and they was for a $2 billion investment deal. And when we discussed, we were very clear if there is anything which is related to corruption or the similar wrongdoing in terms of business practices, the project will be withdrawn right away and given to another country. And believe me, the project was withdrawn. So international investor will consider those type of barriers either as an opportunity when they can address them. Infrastructure, for example, is both a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for investment. Energy, it's the same. So the less concerned investors will take those as opportunity and will be engaged in solving them, while the one who are used to a US environment will rather be discouraged. So we have that dual approach. But one thing I want to say is that it doesn't take a lot to advance free trade. In fact, what countries have to do is almost nothing. It's just let people cross border and goods and services. So it takes more resources to block free trade than to allow it. So it is therefore critical for, and this could even happen without the CFTA. For example, Cameroon and Nigeria could trade and ensure a free movement of product, service, people, without needing any additional framework. So when we speak even about the frameworks, the goals, etc., they are good, they are aspirational, and I understand why my colleagues may be skeptical, Tutufilo will be skeptical. However, just take political will to ensure productive trade and to create a more conducive business environment. And by the way, 50% of the best improved countries in the Doing Business report were based in Africa. And Africa has also achieved most of the reforms in the most recent report. So if on one hand, when looking at from it at the macro perspective, Africa may tend to underperform. When we look at the country-specific level, many of the African countries are among the outperformers globally.
To that point, there was a little clapping there. We'll save that in a second. We only have a little bit less than 10 minutes, so we're going to do 2 more questions, and I'm going to open up to the audience. But you're bringing up just your experience with foreigners, and that's a great transition to talk about China. And China being the largest provider of bilateral loans. We know some countries in Africa have actually given up the land rights, oil, minerals as collateral. And an example, and it's not Africa, is Sri Lanka. The fact that they had to give up their port to China because of debt owed. So, when we talk about that, how do we make sure that countries involved with this agreement don't have the same fate as Sri Lanka, given how much of an influence China has?
So there's a lot of this narrative around China being the new neo-colonialist, new imperialist. I think it's nonsense.
Oh.
So the reason I say that is because it's very paternalistic. It's as if Africans don't have any agency, and there's a choice.
Which is unfortunate, and just to interrupt you, but that is the narrative that you often see internationally. And saying it, as a Canadian, and I see that in just media coverage. But continue.
Yeah, so the point is you've got choice, right? So we're now in a situation where the world is changing geopolitically. You've got this tension between globalism and nationalism. Mm-hmm. You've got this kind of policy dilemma where you have to pick between sides, or do you? And the point is, I think that given renewed interest from the globe, you've now got China stepping up efforts in Africa, and we know that their system is very much cash for resources or cash for infrastructure, primarily government-to-government led. The US has pivoted in its Africa policy, largely centered around China and Russia's influence, but it can be leveraged as well via the private sector to be good for Africa as well. Russia is now reinterested as well. Japan and India are stepping up efforts. So I think here, instead of being a bystander, what African countries need to do is use economic diplomacy effectively. Understand that as a collective, your power can be leveraged. That's when your population size, that's when your young population, that's where all the resources become very effective, and that's when you have muscle and gravitas on a global scale because you become too big to you're too big to ignore.
Yeah.
There's regional integration, there's economic diplomacy. All of these factors, I think, center around the fact that this is Africa's era. We've got the demographics, we've got the resources, but we can't blame anyone apart from ourselves unless we take matters into our own hands. I think, just to change tack slightly, I think one of the other things is that we often hear comparisons around African free trade and integration and the EU.
Yes.
And I think that's very different because one, the selling it to the public in the EU context was a lot easier. We had just come out of World War II. There was a recognition by the populace and the leadership that Europe was stronger together rather than apart, and it was better for peace and prosperity. Now, in an African context, you don't have that luxury of time and stuff being done over decades because we're living in a social media age where consensus is very, very difficult to build, and people want short-term instant gratification, and it doesn't lend itself to complexity. So what you've got then is a situation where you've got these tensions between globalism and nationalism. You've got people who will exploit the fact that it's easier to kind of take the isolationist and insular approach, and that doesn't lend itself to long-term policy making or consensus building. So we've got to do things differently to the way other regions have done it in the past.
And that's actually a good transition, Kola, for you. This is the last question. To take that integration, he suggested all these wonderful aspirational goals as the realist in the room. Given your experience again with all of these countries, how feasible is that, especially when you have a stronghold? And you can bring China into the conversation to further his answer, but what are your thoughts on getting that to work?
Okay, I love the presentation that Rajiv gave here earlier. Action is the word.
Action, yeah.
Action from the standpoint of, somehow, I've seen leaders, not just in Africa, pander to popular voice. And on that basis, it's like me wanting this big audience to all rise up and clap for me. I have things to say to make them do that. But that may not be right. What I've said may not be correct. So we truly need a change of mindset, generally.
Isn't that aspirational?
It's not.
No, because then you can apply that to every single country. Let's really focus on realism and getting it done as opposed to what the popular vote is or how I can
well, you see, again, you have to connect the dots. In connecting the dots is to lift people out of poverty and make them see the light of prosperity. That there are opportunities out there. Rather than be traders of fear, be a trader of hope. You want to build a wall, and you leave your country, you go to Singapore and Vietnam to negotiate with another country that has the potential nuclear power to affect you, and yet around you want to build a wall. Contradiction. So you cannot have that mindset that, okay, on the local space, I want to make everybody to love me and vote me again, so that I make my country great again. And yet, I want to go out there to make another nation prosperous by engaging in a symbiotic relationship. What are you saying? Your neighbor, you want to build a wall. Out there, you want to engage. I don't understand. Now, with Africa, people speak to Africa from the standpoint of a continent that is beggarly. No. Africa cannot be treated in that manner. That is disrespectful. Africans have pride. Africans love to excel. Africans love to shine. We are here, we are doing well. Why do we come to Oxford and we are the best in the class, and then we get back to our country, we can make change happen? So it's primarily for us to take the mindset that made us the best here, making Africa the best there. That's all that Africa wants from you. That's what we need to do. Policy, infrastructure, electricity, water, everything that we require, we can make it happen. People have resources. Oftentimes, you hear that, no, you need to support them, they can't afford it. That's not true. Mobile phone in Nigeria. Before we had a mobile phone, the mindset was, no, the poor cannot afford it. Today, you have poor people out there with 3 or 4 mobile phones, and then they are happy. They just want to say, hi, how are you? Nothing more. And they hear that you're fine, they open their mouth, their teeth, none, and then they grin, they're happy. They're just happy. So really and truly, money loves money. Money gravitates towards money. Yeah. China does not love Africa because Chinese want to be African. No. They love Africa because there is money to be made in Africa. Africa very soon, by population, will be bigger than China. And that is going to happen. The only bet pill required to reduce the population of Africa is electricity. Mm-hmm. Because without electricity, procreation is the name of the game. So you need to electrify Africa quickly.
No. I hope people are writing down these quotes and like tweeting it out and stuff, because this, we need to electrify Africa. And I'm going to pivot to the audience, since you pretty much talked about how amazing they are, and this is the best in the room. So questions, please keep your question extremely short, because we have less than 5 minutes, and you were the first person, so I'm just going to, and please direct your question to whoever you want on the panel.
What would you say about considering an African regional currency as a more practical approach for those skeptical about the African currency in general?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, we can draw some parallels with the European Union around convergence criteria, right? So take West Africa, for example. You've got, in the good years, Nigeria running a current account surplus and a fiscal surplus. You've got Ghana, which runs perennial deficits. Getting that convergence criteria right and setting the foundation before you can adopt a common currency is really important. Otherwise, you've got these kind of economic disconnects which are amplified. So I think you can't put the cart before the horse. And I would kind of urge caution around monetary policy integration and sort out some of the easier stuff and some of the more low-hanging fruit before going down that path. I still want to use the afro.
Still, we don't need. I'm not going to ask the entire panel to weigh in this, just because of time. So if anybody really has a pressing comment to add, okay. Sir, yes, because you were right there. So just throw that catch box, or just speak really loud. Keep your answer pretty short if you can. Oh yeah, pressure, yeah.
That was fun. So there's a lot of talk about policy and large-scale investments, which is fair enough if you're a working government or you work for an investment firm. But as ordinary Africans, whether we're businessmen or professionals, how can we contribute to and benefit from more intra-African trade?
Got to give it to somebody else though. So who? Anybody?
Can you repeat the question?
I actually heard half of it too. So just talking about trade. Sorry, go ahead. Repeat it really loud again, if you could.
So there's a lot of talk about policy, government policy, or these large-scale investments, which is fair enough if you do work in government. But as ordinary Africans, which most of us are here, how can we as businessmen or professionals contribute to more African trade, and how can we actually benefit from more inter-African trade?
That's a big question, given how many countries. So if you want to.
So quickly, meaning as a business person, you have to do business, you have to engage, you have to create sub-regional value chains. Like why don't you outsource some aspect of your production in the countries which are the most competitive, and then aggregate things in also the meaning we have seen that with, for example, South Africa in the car and the automobile industry. So it is already ongoing, and we see that with Dangote having different products in across the region. So it's very important for the business community to be engaged and to take the opportunity, because, again, I said, to have African trade, we need traders, we need investors, we need business people. Everything which is being done now is meaningless without you engaging. And additionally to that, the civil society should also be involved. I think one of the errors of policymakers is not to integrate at the conception level both business leader and civil society, which means that sometimes you have a disconnect between the policy intention and the needs from the business community of the civil society. But that should not prevent the business community to actively engage to shape in the direction which will serve your best interest. Because if we speak about profitable business, then we also speak about job creation and all the other benefits related to the CFTA.
Given the time, I'm being told to wrap up, and I know that we didn't get all of everybody's comments. We are going outside to have tea and coffee, so I would encourage this fabulous audience to engage with the speakers right now. Also engage on social media, because that's really important to get the message going. And I want to thank all of you for that phenomenal conversation. I wish we had more time, because we know we could go on. You guys have been great, so thank you very much, everybody. Great job.